I do think we have a pretty good quorum, so I'm gonna get things rolling. Once again, thanks for joining. My name is Matt McGurk. I work here at Source Defense as a solution architect, and what we're going to be doing today is a roundtable discussion with some four leading experts in the QSA community around specifically payment page security. There's two new requirements in DSS4, requirements 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. And as they are new and in some ways a novel topic in security overall, we thought it might be valuable to have some experts talk about them. So I think what I'll do here, I'll turn off the screen share just for one moment, and I'll ask our attendees to introduce themselves. So maybe, let's see, who's on the top of my list? How about Kyle? Kyle, would you mind introducing yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Kyle Hinterberg. I'm a manager and a QSA with LBMC. Kind of got my start as a sysadmin, moved into being an ISA for a number of years, been a QSA now for the past 6 or so years. And so, yeah, definitely have had a chance to cut my teeth a little bit in PCI.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Richard, maybe you can go next.
My name is Richard Haig with Intersect Worldwide, Vice President of Compliance Services. I've personally been a QSA for coming up on 20 years and in the payments industry for 25 years.
Thank you very much. Robert, you're next on my list.
Perfect. Robert Davidson. I'm the National Practice Director over AT&T Cybersecurity's PCI practice, soon to be Level Blue Consulting. Been in this game a long time, and it's always fun.
Awesome. Jeff?
Yeah, I'm Jeff Mann. I'm a QSA working for a company called Online Business Systems. I've been doing PCI for 20 years, similar to Richard. And one of the places I hung my hat for a time was AT&T Security. So Robert, I'm sure we know a bunch of the same people, those that stayed behind.
Miss you, Jeff.
Prior to PCI, I worked primarily in the government for the DoD. So somewhere there's a story about how an NSA cryptographer ended up doing PCI. But another webinar for another day.
Thank you, Jeff. And Talia, I think that leaves you. Last but not least.
Thank you. I am Sully Perella, Technical Director at Shellman. I have been a QSA for about 12 years. Also have a background in cryptography, and I support the P2P, PIN, 3DS, SSF functions for our org.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. We appreciate it. It's a lot of expertise on the phone. I've been here at Source Defense for 6 years, working in this area of security, client-side security, of which this new payment page stuff is a subset. I have a background in web application development for anyone who's curious on the phone. So if there are technical questions, not quite the goal of today's session, but in general, that's what I get paid for. So what I'd like to do here for the next couple minutes is just talk about some context. I swear it won't take more than a few minutes, but I want to make sure everybody's level set and we all have our feet underneath us for this. So what we are talking about is payment page security. As I mentioned, what that means in the world of PCI DSS is a web page that contains card data, and there's a couple different definitions that we'll talk about there. This is new to PCI DSS 4.0. 3.2.1, the general strategy, as I understand it, would have been to rely on a trusted payment service provider to embed a payment method via an iframe. And that would have put you in really great shape as a merchant to descope fairly significantly, at least in this one area. Over the course of time, as 3.2.1 was living and breathing, we saw the rise in what I would call a mage cart or client-side attack. So basically a kind of cybersecurity attack that occurs within the web page, not in the web app, not on the server, not in databases, but at runtime as the customer is making their purchase. And so it's a new gap to fill. It is, just to reiterate the distinction there. There's lots of stuff in DSS about securing your servers, files at rest, even TLS, SSL as things are going back and forth, but there was really no consideration of the browser as its own kind of unique execution environment. To wax just a little bit historical, if you think about it, when this 15 years ago, web pages were more or less pages out of a magazine. And today you can run a copy of Adobe Photoshop from inside a web page. So things have graduated significantly along the way, leading to new and pretty unique security concerns. The relevant requirements in DSS 4.0 are 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. And it's always intimidating giving my interpretation of these in front of a panel of experts, but I think I got this one pretty dialed down. The idea here is that on a web page where card data is present, a merchant must have a mechanism to make sure that those scripts are authorized to be there, like somebody knows why they're there and they should be. Mechanism to assure the integrity of those scripts, and an inventory maintained of all of those scripts. So, it's kind of foundational stuff. It's like, we can't just be cowboys anymore about our web pages and throw whatever marketing tech is most recent in there. It needs to be part of a business and security process to make sure that the overall card processing process is secure. 11.6.1 then I view it as a complement and somewhat a tamper-proofing exercise for the mechanisms one would implement for 6.4.3. A merchant must have a way to monitor the payment page headers that are associated with the payment page. For anyone who may be unfamiliar, these are HTTP response headers, basically the metadata that comes along with a web page that is sent by a web server. We don't see it when we're navigating through a website, but it tells the server how to behave. And some of those behaviors are security. And so it's important to monitor the headers, because otherwise there could be changes that indicate a compromise, or et cetera. And then you must have a mechanism to basically alert on any suspicious behavior, changes to content or to scripts that is unintended, and thus make sure that everything is working as expected. So those are the bones of it. There is guidance in DSS as well to help solve for these requirements. They're called a couple different approaches, basically. One here I'm calling a multi-solution approach. They call out a couple of technologies in specific: content security policy and sub-resource integrity. Those are part of the World Wide Web Consortium spec for how browsers and servers talk to each other. And basically that's a whitelisting, blacklisting approach combined with a way to hash files, to fingerprint files and make sure they don't change without somebody knowing about it. Usually I describe these as well-intentioned technologies. There are very good use cases for them. I find that in the case of marketing technologies and in kind of a rich, modern e-commerce website, it can be very, very difficult to implement these, but they are a way to go about it. And then the complement to this would also be some kind of business process and some kind of business software to track those justifications, authorizations, and who's filling those out, yada, yada, yada. That's the first half of the guidance that's in there. The second half refers to a proprietary tag management system or script that can prevent the execution of malicious code. I'm calling it here a proprietary solution or a tool-based approach. This is what Source Defense, this is who we are. We're a vendor for this. This conversation today is not a sales pitch for Source Defense, but it's what we do. In my opinion, what we've seen in the market, and what I've seen, just whatever my opinion's worth, what I've seen over the last little bit from merchants is that they're in a spot where they have to meet these requirements soon, and they may think they do, but they don't really have the engineering or dev or compliance hours to put into building that approach like I talked about before. So as I understand it, a tool-based approach is how a lot of folks are leaning. In my opinion, those tools should let you do things like automate the analysis, the identification, the classification of all those scripts, basically the inventorying part of that, along with a workflow for justification. You should have mechanisms in place to verify the integrity. And I think this is the most important part. It goes back to the thing I just said a moment ago. The only point of having a tool is that it should make work easier, right? So that the tool should really reduce the amount of work you have to do. A couple of just notes for us: we can help a number of ways that don't involve purchasing our products whatsoever. I'll talk about it at the end, but if you did want us to do an analysis of your site for no cost, we can give you a dashboard to tell you what's going on there for free. Something I do in my role as kind of an evangelist is just like free process guidance and training. So if anybody wants to know what I think further about how they should go about this or what I've seen from other people, I'm happy to do that. And we can also help you figure out how to make it as painless as possible. So those are the notes I wanted to hit there. And that's my overview of the topic in general. I'm going to now kind of broach the topic of discussion. We're going to get away from PowerPoint, thankfully. And I would offer to the audience as well, any questions you have on these as we go, do feel free to put them into the Q&A section as well. I will be pulling those and observing as we go through. So without further ado, something I talked about at the top was payment service providers, iframes. There's been a little bit of a change this week with the DOT revision of 4.0. that calls out more specifically what the responsibilities are around the payment service provider and the merchant. And so my question for the group is, when you think about payment page security, how has scope changed from 3.2.1 to 4.0? I'll throw that to whoever wants it can take it.
I
I'll
guess
jump in.
Go
Well, see,
ahead.
that's why we raise hands. Age before beauty. How's that? No, I'm glad you brought up the recent changes, because I think even in your presentation, I did balk a little bit at one thing you said about pages where card data is present.
Mhm.
I think one of the big questions with the release of version 4.0 in terms of scope is, what are we talking about when we talk about web pages? And I think that they've clarified it, hopefully, in the 0.1 release this week. Although I think some of their clarification is probably still open to interpretation. Be interested to hear what other QSAs think. But the intention is very clearly in version 4 that at least part of what is being looked at is the web pages that are at the merchant site that are even the pages that are doing a redirect to a third-party payment processor or serving up an iframe or some sort of redirect. So very much the intention of version 4 is what we used to call the e-commerce server, the e-commerce page, and not just what I would call the payment page, which is the checkout function. Anybody want to add further clarification to that language? But I think that's important to point out, just in terms of what are we talking about and what does PCI mean by web page in the standard.
With their clarification, my interpretation of it was, really that the payment page is going to be, if you're hosting it yourself, you're a merchant, you have your own payment page, whatever website, whatever URL you're at, when a customer is entering your credit card information, that's your payment page. And if you have an iframe on that page, the surrounding page is still your payment page. On the iframe, the third-party service provider has to deal with it. If you do a redirect, that can get you out of the requirement to need to do it, because then that's the third-party service provider's requirement to do that. They essentially own the payment page entirely at that point.
I'm going to disagree with that one. Not to start like a disagreement, 12 minutes in.
Let's do it.
Well, that's why we're all here.
So in terms of scope, right? Payment pages, SAQA, that's all the same. And what people commonly think of it, where scripts are being loaded on these payment pages, there's a lot more than was previously identified, right? To what Mark and Jeff have said, or Matt and Jeff, sorry. The tracking, marketing, all of those details execute on those same things. And just like an iframe or a redirect can execute and then allow a different organization to receive that data directly on the cardholder's browser, that execution can be compromised so that an attacker can also capture that data, even if it's a reader.
So
I don't think
clarify
that
when you say redirect, do you actually mean the term hey, we're redirecting it to a completely third party, or are you referring to would you consider an iframe a redirect?
I do not consider an iframe a redirect. I consider an iframe more like a sandboxed environment.
Okay.
In that context. And then the redirect is just that, right? It's going to load somebody else's page. That page itself is the responsibility of the third-party service provider. But the script that sends the card holder, that is in scope for this requirement.
The language I fall back on, I think there is some nuance in this one. The language I fall back on, and it's very specific, was the page that contains the URL of the payment service provider's work, the service they provide, the page that contains the URL. I think that in my opinion, uninformed, somewhat, the requirement is hinting at when can a person be duped into giving their card number to someone else. It extends beyond getting it out of the form itself, the embedded inside the iframe form. That's why the parent page has been dragged back in to scope, because if you can modify that parent page, then you can get the card from there. So
That's exactly what I'm saying.
and it's
Yes.
interesting to me that the language in the revision was saying something like, that the trusted payment service provider absolutely has to provide evidence that they're meeting these requirements for the other folks. So it seems like everybody's thinking about this merchant payment gateway relationship, and it's certainly broadened more than before.
Well, the way I read the applicability notes for point one for this requirement is the council wants both ends evaluated and to be covered by this requirement in terms of keeping an inventory of scripts and so on and so forth. The 3 bullet points that are the essence of the requirement, but the applicability notes, which I think say in a very wordy fashion, the merchant side, and they don't call it merchant, they call it entity for some reason, because that's the generic term. They're responsible for their side, and the third party, whoever's doing the embedded form, providing that, they're responsible for their end. I mean, I read that as they want both done. Merchant is the entity that does it on their side. Third party service provider is the one that does it on their side. But to me, it's very clear that both sides are supposed to be done. That's a scope answer. Then it's a matter of who's responsible for doing it on each end. And that's where perhaps the wheels will continue to come off a little bit.
I would agree that on the page doing a redirect that it makes sense, but my understanding still of the clarifications and the guidance is that if you're doing a redirect, you're not required to do 643.1161, and that their guidance kind of mirrors the documentation that they already have in the SAQA. If you look in the 4.0 version of SAQA for 643 and 1161, they both have call outs that say essentially if you're doing a redirect, these don't apply, and that you only need to do them if you're either hosting your own page or if you are leveraging an iframe. And like, even if you look at the in the DSS, the current version, the call out for what a payment page is, it's going to be the page that's capturing credit card information. So as long as you're doing a redirect, essentially at that point, you're not going to have responsibility for a payment page.
Yeah, I agree with that, Kyle, because I think that was part of the motivation for doing a 0.1 in the first place, because the original 4.0 release, and I forget which order it was, but the DSS mentioned redirect and the SAQA didn't, or vice versa. Yeah. So they did drop the redirect in the standard. So moving forward, we're just talking about embedded iframes, essentially.
Right, and I also want to clarify. I think most of these QSAs on this call, right? We talk about scoping as being one of the most important, but the reality is this stuff is super important to do all over your site. What we're talking about right now is like the minimum standard, right? The very minimum standard. I know when we talk, about these requirements, really you want to know what all scripts run on your entire website and every page. The applicability here is very key, and that's kind of what we're arguing about here. But I also lean on my understanding was the redirect is not necessarily a requirement, but it is a good practice.
This is where I get stuck. If you look at the term payment page scripts in the glossary of 401, right? It talks about anything that's being interpreted. This is what I think, Matt, I feel like I'm quoting Matt here. Anything that's interpreted by the consumer's browser, right? Which includes a redirect.
But that would be on a payment page, and the redirect page wouldn't be a payment page, because if you look at their definition of a payment page, it's where payment card data is being captured. So it would be the same that they should have on their homepage. They should, be looking at their scripts, or if they're just collecting information for, email blasts, they should still be looking at those scripts, but it wouldn't be necessarily PCI required.
I think that obviously, despite their attempts at clarity, even the dot revision may have still left some ambiguity in the matter. From a practical security standpoint, what I've always said is that, it's what these attacks open people up to, what merchants or anyone running a website, what it opens them up to is an attacker like basically hijacking the brand and the UX of the site overall. So Robert, I think to your point, there's a letter of the law and there's like practically solving the security problem, right? So I'm not going to speak to the letter of the law because I don't have to. But the like, if anybody can get into anywhere the front end of your web app, an attacker, they can very convincingly fool a visitor into doing that. The compliance issue aside, the general security solve, right, is the site-wide thing. How practical that is for everybody, how much that is the goal of their project, so on and so forth, I think is very valid. Obviously, lots of discussion around this one. I do think I'm going to drill into perhaps another subject. We could just bracket that one off. How about this one? So there's a lot of changes more generally. There have been a lot of changes in 6.4.3, excuse me, in DSS4 and DSS 4.0.1. 6.4.3 and 11.61 are very new topics, and I hear about them a lot because of the nature of my work. Do you guys see those being a common theme across when you're talking to folks about their gaps? Are they thinking about 6.4.3 and 11.6.1 in specific a lot? Or is it new, or they have not heard about it? How popular is it as a gap when you're speaking to folks?
I mean, I'll start that one off.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think ever since MageCart really started hitting the scene, we've started having these conversations around how do we secure our site for these specific attacks. Now, the reality is there's been a lot of solutions put forth by the industry to help solve this problem. Now, I think PCI we're probably, a few years into this at this point, but I'm glad that they're forcing it the way they're forcing it. I think, I don't know, I'll speak for me, but I know I'm a little bit concerned, not for the big guys, but for the small guys. I think that's going to be the challenge for most of the implementation of these requirements. But the big guys have been doing this for a while, I think. But now the small guys are doing it. So that's going to be the struggle. And I think that's where, y'all's solution is going to be very helpful in the marketplace.
Kind of on a similar note to that, something I've seen, kind of on the big guy side is that while they have been doing it, I feel like it hasn't always right now bubbled into security as much as it likely should have. And it was more on the, development side, e-com management side. And a lot of the clients I've been working with, you bring this up and it's like, oh yeah, we have this. We're just not making use of it yet. We're not, really leveraging from a security standpoint. And so I feel like that's been somewhat of a shift is even for organizations that have it in play, trying to get it funneled into, what they need to be doing specifically for PCI, getting the, security folks involved in all of that.
So I have two observations. What are we seeing? One is I cannot remember a time in the last 15 or 20 years where I've seen not one, not two, but I think at last year's community meeting, North American community meeting, there were 6 different vendors that had on their banners, "We help meet a specific PCI requirement." I've been going around to technical conferences, vendor conferences for better part of the last 10 years. And I usually struggle when I talk to a vendor to get them to understand any PCI requirement they meet. Usually they're like, yeah, we do compliance. We do SOX, ISO, PCI, HIPAA, all of the above. So the fact that there's actually vendors out there that are focused on meeting specific requirements is phenomenal. And I want to echo what Robert's saying about the concern about the small guys, because we can't talk about these two requirements without talking about SAQA and the millions of small merchants out there that rely on essentially doing nothing PCI related, security related, because all they have to do is fill out the short form and say that they're using a PCI compliant third party. Here's the AOC. Now, all of a sudden, this is why we're having such a big debate about scope and applicability in terms of which side of the payment page or what is the payment page, because small merchants that have never done anything before, and I'm speaking generically to some degree, are now having to do something. And not only are they having to come up with, and they've got a year to come up with something to meet 643 and 1161, they're also now subject to ASV scans. And that's not a new requirement, so they didn't even get a grace period for that. I don't know about you guys, but I've got clients right now that are not necessarily the small merchants, but the larger merchants that sort of partition off their e-commerce so that they can do an SAQA or SAQA equivalent requirements, they're freaking out a little bit, to be quite honest.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I've coined a term, and I don't mind saying it, but inverse pain, where basically the smaller the organization, the greater this pain is for them to meet. If you're an Amazon, you have every engineering dollar in the world to throw at making the payment pages meet the new requirement. If you're, selling hot sauce, it's going to be way more difficult for you. And there's, of course, a conversation then about being in with the platform players in this space and what their responsibility is, aside from a payment service provider, although that could, of course, overlap that Venn diagram. We do work, Source Defense works on the small merchant task force to make sure that those voices get heard, because as I've had these conversations, I started talking about this 6 years ago with customers, and I've started talking in the last 18 months with folks in the specific area, and the need is way different, and in some ways is a little onerous on the smaller folks. So I think it's important that we talk
Yeah,
about that.
I don't even know. Like, you find a merchant and then you approach them, you say, hey, you need an ASB scan. They're like, a what? You explain what that is. Then they get this scan and then they go, what am I looking at?
Yep.
And it's, yeah, I really don't feel like we're doing the e-commerce space much of a favor by creating these requirements, which are grounded in security. I believe the why these rules exist. That's important. But I don't think there's any easy means for a merchant to understand what is going on or how to address that. Because they get the scan, they got to address it. If there's, TLS 1.1, I don't know what that is. How do I change that? Who am I talking to? This is a great chance for service providers who are hosting these merchant environments to step up. But it's
so funny
I
you should
don't-
mention that, Sully, because I was going to say the 800-pound gorilla in the room is those hosting providers that basically indemnify all of their small merchants by saying, come with
payback.
us, use our platform,
That's right.
and don't even worry about PCI. We've got you covered. Who's doing the scan? And where is the scan? And I happen to have some clients that are in that bucket, and I'm kind of scratching what's left of the hair on my head, trying to figure out what to deal with them, how to deal with them.
Well, if they're acquiring bank, if the payment facilitator's acquiring bank, with the payment facilitator being the merchant of record, is not being pushed to say, hey, I'm scanning my 10,000 sub-merchants, it's not happening.
Or they have approval, right?
Or they have approval to not do it. Correct.
Yeah.
I saw an interesting comment in the Q&A, which is that some SAQA filers, maybe even larger, were under or misinformed about how much this could impact the security of the card data, the site, based on their implementation with their PSP. The question I think is interesting here is, what type of guidance have you all seen in terms of what type of guidance or implementation guides have you seen from PSPs to better inform merchants on this topic, if any? I'll say from my side, I don't know that I've seen them yet.
I don't think I've seen any or heard from any of my clients that they have had anything directly informed about how to do that.
Yeah,
same.
There hasn't been any guidance. I mean, half the time the acquirers will point you to your QSA.
Yeah.
Or if you're lucky, sometimes they're like, oh, you don't have to worry about it. So.
Well, I mean, we are supposed to be the experts, but unfortunately, the way the system is designed, 99% of merchants out there that fit that small category are not required to talk to a QSA. Who are they left to talk to?
That's true.
And I'll also add that a lot of these companies in question that we're talking about, this was not my idea. Somebody pointed it out to me a couple of years ago, but they don't have to go through any kind of vetting or certification. They can just kind of hang out a shingle and start offering this stuff. And until somebody catches up to them, they can pretty much say what they want to their merchants.
They can, but I mean, depending on the model, the service provider has their own KYC elements that they've got to address based on, again, it's what the acquirer says. Because if the acquirer says, hey, don't worry about it, it's hands off.
Sometimes I wish that the PCI Council would come out with a certification that acquirers need to go through, so they have their own, similar to an ISA or QSA, but at the acquirer to actually understand what's going on.
So I have an
Good
interesting.
luck on that one, Kyle. But yeah,
Yeah.
So there's two technologies that are called out in the guidance, specifically CSP and SRI. And I'm curious what you guys have seen in the field so far as adoption or attempted adoption. I think that that's entirely out of scope for a modestly sized merchant, but on larger accounts, larger merchants, your level ones and et cetera, what are they thinking about solution wise in general? And have you seen those kind of projects start with kind of roll our own CSP SRI stuff? Just curious.
I think
Yeah, I've
everybody's
seen.
looking for a vendor. In a lot of cases, they might already have a vendor that they just have to flip a switch. But CSP is a directive to the browser that tends to break stuff quite often. And so a lot of our larger sites, they might try it and they get some pushback, particularly from marketing and sales, and that's the end of that. So
I've seen
And I
kind
think-
of a mix of just quick trying to use more of the SRIs for some essentially standardized scripts that aren't expected to change, but obviously you get some of the bigger script providers in the world that you can't really hash their scripts, and it's going to throw everything into chaos every time they change. And so leveraging some of the CSP there, so kind of a mix of approaches, and even on that, all trying to essentially do your own iframe or your own redirect where you have your payment page, but you jump over to another small page that just takes a credit card. So that way you can have that, script free or, very minimally scripted. So I have seen some approaches that are all still, I feel like, working their way out to see if it's going to work.
So I think we have to be aware, most of us are in cybersecurity, and we have to be aware of the other business units. And the thing that's very interesting about, this requirement, especially the, identification and of all of the scripts, is that the payment page is like one of the most critical pages for your product teams and your marketing teams to monitor. And most organizations, most e-commerce sites heavily monitor those sites as far as, where your mouse is, what data is being put into that, how long are you sitting there? These elements are used by the business to ultimately help, get people to purchase more. These things aren't going to go away, right? But we have to be aware as cybersecurity professionals that, hey, these things exist and what their capabilities are. So I see that as an important consideration when we're starting to review all of these payment scripts, or scripts related to the payment page.
It's way too easy just to say, get rid of all of them.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're not going to do it. I mean, that's not true. I've seen some people do it.
I think it's important we take a quick minute to explain to everybody on this who may not know what CSP and SRI are. That imagine this kind of like you walk into your kitchen, right? You open up your refrigerator, you see a bunch of stuff that is there, you put it there, right? Now, if you open up your refrigerator and you see a bottle of some green goo that you didn't put there, you're gonna be like, that's suspicious. How did that get there? Similar to that, in a payment page, you have what is supposed to run. These are the things that are going to tell you, to Robert's point, how many hits you have, how long somebody sits in that page, how they behave, how all of the things that you want to gather so you know your customer. You can better tailor your services. But an attacker can place something in there that can compromise the security of this transaction, and then the card holders, like the actual person who's loading this web page, when it says, loading them, that's where this attack occurs. And if there's something wrong there, then you, being the provider of the server giving this, needs to be able to say that goo doesn't belong here. What are you going to do about it? And with CSP and SRI, these things are a failed closed operation, meaning that if your computer, you set these rules up and you're like, I know I've got milk, I know I got eggs, got bread, anything else shows up in there, then you just can't get in the fridge. Nobody can, which means no transactions are happening. So if your spouse comes home and they throw an apple in there, something you should expect, something that's normal, it still fails closed because you didn't document it. And that's where changes to these pages without a really good development operational update cycle can prevent merchants from taking payments. Sorry, I just want to kind of break that
I
down.
think
for
that's
everybody.
very eloquently stated. And it's always, I think it's always useful to clarify, no matter if everybody's super informed, because nobody came out of the womb knowing what CSP and SRI were. So it's good to capture. I think that there's a
Speak for
couple.
your own kids, Matt.
Well, yeah, at the Perella household, they're hitting the ground running. I think what from the web developer standpoint, there's a couple areas that I would just emphasize there. A lot of this marketing integration tech uses techniques where the code changes on the fly, meaning that as the checkout flow loads, the code coming from Google Analytics could change at the time of request, like it bakes in a user token, or they use a technique called cache busting, where they put junk in there to make sure that the most recent version of the file loads. And that's it's impossible to fingerprint or hash something that is constantly changing. It's literally usually the way I describe it is CSP and SRI would work really well if you had the world's simplest intranet application. If your company was building a time clock and you own the developers, well, you employ the developers and you own the development cycle and you own the code and the infrastructure and everything else, then you can write a really clean CSP SRI implementation for that one thing. As soon as you start to introduce a marketing team arbitrarily adding code to the site, third-party vendors constantly changing their stuff, a development team that now has to deploy and maintain CSP itself, and all of that with the pressure of don't turn off the thing that makes the money. Like that becomes basically that's a whole department we've almost outlined there to make sure that all goes successfully. So I know I'm coming from a vendor, so I have an opinion, but I've also built this stuff and I don't want anyone to have to suffer more than I have in the past, I guess. I think what I wanted to pivot to just a little bit, we have a lot of big merchants on the phone, a lot of level 1 folks today. And it's something I've been curious about because of my work, because of everything else, is like documentation around this. So as you guys start to look into working with these folks on an ROC or other documentation, and you're thinking about 6.4.3 and 11.6.1, like what would you really want to see besides like a cocktail napkin saying, yes, we did this? Like what's good solid evidence for that? And when do you expect that in your kind of audit cycle? It's I'm sure that yesterday is always good, but Richard, I saw you smile at that. Do you want to take a crack at it?
Spreadsheet. I think a lot of our larger clients, they're looking at tools that automate this to some extent and capture that authorization and document what's happening. Like you mentioned, these scripts and these pages change, and trying to keep track of stuff like that in a spreadsheet is just not going to happen. You might be able to do it in GitHub or something along those lines, but we're really kind of encouraging our clients to go with the tools.
I mean, Matt, don't get too excited here, but I would prefer tools like you guys, right? That self-document, send me, hey, here's this change. Keep messaging it to me. Hey, this has changed. You need to update this. And then at the end of the, period or whenever that period we're looking at, you can send me the reports and say, hey, these are all of our, sources and this is all of our systems. This is everything that we have. It's effectively the same as, we have many clients that manage scope, constantly changing, constantly evolving. I would imagine most of us here aren't keeping manual scoping. It's the same thing. We need automated tools.
It would be the same. I was just going to say same idea as using a spreadsheet to track your system inventory. How long is that going to last and how is that going to work? Technically, can it be compliant? Yeah, it can be if you're working on it all the time, but doing that for scripts is going to be the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we see a lot of organizations going to solutions, and then as a QSAs, we just want to see that is consistently maintained and responded to. If something something flags, triggers, whatever, what's your after action? We see the change control for that, which shows their responsiveness, that it addresses what we know to be the scope of those pages, and it definitely simplifies the whole process. That's for sure.
That's very interesting.
On a very simple site, though, you could do it completely manual.
You could.
But I think what we're referring to really right now is all of those dynamic content, dynamic third-party service providers that could create significant changes all throughout the period.
So I have a question for this group that's somewhat related to this question that you're asking. There is reference in the standard, both in 4.0 and 4.01, to these requirements, or at least the 643 requirement, pertaining not only to the entity in question, which we've argued about, but also third, and they even talk about fourth party service providers. Is that, what do they mean by fourth party, first of all? And is that also not an attempt to just, cast a very wide net and make sure all the scripts everywhere are being accounted for?
I think
That's a
your last
great
sentence
question.
nails it. It's
Go ahead,
capture
Sully.
all. I'm sorry. I think the whole intent is to capture all of it. So if you're saying I use a third party, and that third party is really just a broker of their third parties,
Mhm.
which would be your fourth party. It's like those weird, first, second cousins charts. You've you've got this handoff, but
Right.
if your server is providing it and it's executing on your customer's browser, the intent is what that is. Even if
Well,
it's
I would go one further there, Sully, because I have clients, let's say acme.com, they're selling widgets. I'm Looney Tunes reference. But they outsource the hosting of their, whatever we call this thing, e-commerce site, website, payment site, to a third party. It's hosted by a third party. It's also written, developed, and maintained by yet another third party. And then they go to the payment processor that's giving them an iframe to embed. So again, I think they're trying to be inclusive. I think they're trying to prevent people from coming up with ways to dodge. Well, I don't have to do anything because I've outsourced this to a third party, or fourth, or fifth, or sixth party.
in QSA Dreamland, this is where a service provider's 12.9 obligations. This is what we do. This is how we do it. This is how we impact your environment. So if we are maintaining your payment page, then we are going to provide you a list of scripts and a way to communicate updates to them in a routine manner. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts, and with so many hands in that pot, it is difficult at best.
And there is a unique aspect to this particular thing. So we hear this word supply chain in cybersecurity and in compliance and in a bunch of places. And, it can mean we installed routers that had firmware that had malware in it. And then that 10 years later turned into a thing. It can mean SolarWinds where something got breached, yada, yada, yada. This one, in my opinion, is a little unique, right? Because it's very dynamic. It's based on the interaction between these marketing technologies and the privileges that we as web developers enjoyed for a really long time to be really permissive with what our code would do. So it's not at all unusual to see a marketing team have control over something called a tag manager, which is an easy way for non-technical people to add code to the site. Adding a marketing tool, which is a third party. That marketing tool in turn adds another tool to the site, not just a library, but a full-blown, let's call it JavaScript application to do some kind of analysis or translation. And then if you have a display advertising network, that extends out. So you get this geometric expansion that happens at runtime inside of the web page. So my heart weeps for those who have to try to figure that out, looking at the developer tools in Google Chrome and figuring out when all these scripts loaded and where they came from, because you're looking at a hydra. It grows new heads every single time it goes. So I got a little poetical in there. I apologize, guys, but I thought it was, it's just neat to me because I like web browsers, I guess. I'm that kind of nerd. Let's see. What do we got going on over here? I have a question about CSP, security headers, CSP directives and such. Either disable backwards compatibility. That's an interesting point, actually. CSP and SRI, for anyone who's an ultra web spec nerd, are relatively recent additions to the World Wide Web specs. Like, if you have a use case, if you're a merchant out there who serves a community that uses the library to access your site, there's a great chance the web browsers at that library do not support CSP. Can a site provide a similar level of security to the merchant's page without CSP? Okay, so I'm from a vendor, but yes, you can do it. There's other approaches to it. One could nominally write your own in-house if you really felt like taking on that engineering challenge. There's people like Source Defense and there's others. So we don't need to do a pitch here exactly, but there are options beyond CSP and SRI and beyond header-based approaches is what I would offer.
I'd be kind of surprised to see a browser that didn't support CSP or SRI, but did support TOS 1.2.
We can, yeah, we can do it. I use the site called caniuse.com, which tells me what web text I can use when I'm building an app. That's a fun, we'll leave that as an exercise to the audience. If you guys want to figure out what the Venn diagram is of browsers that support TLS 1.1 but not CSP, that's part of the home game. And please
Oh,
enjoy.
that's a good question. I like that. Whoever sent that in, thanks. I like it.
I think that something I'm curious about, so like I've just said a number of times, I came from app dev, I came from doing some e-commerce stuff and et cetera. Deadline for this stuff is March of next year, at least in terms of the assessment and rolling and all that other stuff. Something I think about is that you have to make changes in code to implement a lot of these controls. So are you hearing from folks, we're trying to get this done now because we turn off all the development work in October to, again, prevent the money machine from going offline? That's what I've heard sometimes. So are folks like tackling this now, or do you hear like, oh yeah, we're going to turn it on April 1st, 2025? Where's that fallen?
Matt, let me pick on you a little bit on your wording before we answer the question.
Please.
Next year is not a deadline. It's a threshold. It's when we as the QSA start coming in and saying, are you doing this? But I balk at anything that suggests that this is a destination you get to and you're done. Because security, which PCI is attempting to impart on all these entities, is a journey, and it's continuous, and it doesn't stop. So that said, I'll let somebody answer your question.
I think that's a great point. It is a journey, not a destination, so to speak.
Right now,
the
I would
reality
say
is,
Oh, we've heard from you a second. Why don't you go ahead, please?
I was just going to say that right now, all the clients I'm working with, all of them, this is probably the number one item, at least for anyone in e-commerce, that they're working through as a 4.0 gap that they are, trying to hammer, try to tackle. I feel like most of them are, somewhere in a halfway point where they have it, kind of working, not all the way, still working to implement it, get it fine tuned with the goal of trying to make sure it's, set and in place well before the not the deadline, but the goal time of making sure you can satisfy a QSA, but really, having it in place before the end of the year. And with that, dialing it back with the idea that, the last couple months of the year, nothing ever gets done.
I would agree.
Yeah, I got nothing to. I echo Kyle's answer.
The general idea is try to get it done soon. Is what I'm hearing from the
Sooner
team.
rather than later.
Because
I
I
do
mean,
think that's a real, Jeff, to your point, I think it's a really interesting point. It is a threshold value. And I think like a lot of compliance stuff, the goal is to incentivize, if you will, behavior that was probably always a good idea, right? Like this problem has existed for an extremely long time. These have been in best practice and in draft for what, like 18 months, 2 years now or something. So that's a great way to look at it, is that
it's like IPv6. It's been around for 20, 25 years. Still picking up steam.
I think I look at all those letters and numbers and I get a headache. So I feel IPv6 one day we'll be there. Let's see what else we got coming down the pike here in chat. I thought this was interesting. This is fairly technical, and so maybe I'll just answer this one myself. But it is about kind of single page applications and the idea that a web application that's not just one HTML document after another, but it's kind of a lot of active content that gets loaded into the browser and updates on the fly. You don't really click through pages so much as you load a page. That kind of my Adobe Photoshop example from before. That I think we've covered, at least in the spirit of the thing, is that what these requirements are trying to do is to get you to monitor what the scripts are doing as they execute, not just have a list of them, not just, kind of know that they're there on, somebody said, on a yellow legal pad and then look at it every so often. It's actually understanding how these are interacting with your visitors and what the data is doing, and making sure that that's not changing in a way you don't want it to. And I think that I would want to open it up for as many questions as the folks want. So now's the time if anyone wants to throw things in the chat. Let's see what else we've got here.
So there's a question that just came in about the smaller merchants that are going to be filling out SAQA and have to respond to 643 and 1161. I mean, like everything else, it's a checkbox, and in theory, nobody's holding them to it until something bad happens. Except for more and more merchants these days are engaging with QSAs just to get a little bit of help and guidance. I mean, my firm has a lot of smaller merchants that we're helping. I think that's partially because MasterCard several years ago for a time required level 2 merchants, somewhat smaller merchants, to start doing full-blown assessments. They've backed off on that, but I think that sort of started the set the precedent or started the trend of not quite big enough merchants engage in QSAs, at least to give them some guidance and help. And again, QSAs in the ecosystem of PCI are the ones that are supposed to be the security experts that interpret and apply guidance and make the appropriate risk-based interpretation for all these entities that are subject to it. So, the more you engage a QSA, the better off you are, in generally speaking. At least the ones represented here on this call today.
I would just build on that, though. We've been talking about compliance, deadlines, new requirements. Every requirement in the standard is based on breach. And the reason you see it in SAQA is because websites have been getting breached for the last 5-6 years. This will evolve, probably include your whole site, not just a payment page in the future. 10 years ago, if you had an iframe or a redirect, you were out of scope. You didn't process, you didn't transmit, you didn't store card rate data. We were done. So, I would just add that this is likely to change. But at the end of the day, it's great to meet a deadline, but if you get breached, that is just a horrible thing for any merchant to go through. We've even seen small merchants that really can't afford it, quite frankly. They get put out of business. And, if your site is distributing malware or keystroke loggers or e-skimmers and stealing data, it has impact to you financially. And so, you should want to prevent that and not subject your customers to identity theft.
And one thing too, even just beyond like e-skimmers and stuff, if you look at the recent headlines, there's been numerous times where people are running scripts that they intend to run that are sending sensitive data to third parties that they were not intending to send that sensitive data to. And so even in the, non-malicious, realm, there's things to look into as far as these requirements go.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a parallel topic, but in over in healthcare land, we saw Meta harvesting a whole bunch of medical information from Find a Doctor web pages. And then that ended up saying, like, do you need dialysis on their Facebook page? Totally separate topic, but everything is interrelated. And it's obviously I work in this field, but it's only going to become more important, I think. As we come to our conclusion here, I would solicit for, we're still getting there, but Sully, go ahead after you.
Just real quick. Richard's comment about everything being based on breaches is very accurate. I appreciate that point. For any organization unfortunate enough to go through a breach, they're going to see your last SAQA or your report on compliance, and that's going to be provided to your acquirer, the legal, anybody suing you. It becomes something you thought you were never going to have to look at again is now your document saying, you said you were doing this. You weren't. Now you're on the hook. And it's a really bad gotcha that the bank can then hold you accountable, even though you just want to sell your service, your widget. And that's hard, to put it very mild.
Absolutely. We're coming down to our final minutes here. I want to prompt the audience. If you do have thoughts, please populate them now. And I'd also like to ask our group, I'll go first, but I want to ask you each to offer maybe 1 or 2 key takeaways that you've thought of over the course of this conversation. Like, what's your kind of summarizing thought if you have one? And I'll start there first. And I think it's just the theme is that we have to understand the browser and web pages as their own special and unique and vulnerable environment, in addition to servers and to databases and to stuff inside of a firewall and et cetera. It's just a different paradigm than most folks are used to thinking of. But that web page that used to be the functional equivalent of tearing a page out of a magazine and looking at it is now its own living, breathing thing that you are effectively shipping out to a customer every single time that they go to your website. You've given them a whole full-blown desktop application that you do every time, and there's security responsibility and onus that comes along with it. So it doesn't need to be, a big, scary, awful topic. It's just that it's a new thing that we need to get our hands around, in addition to um, enjoying the benefits of having all that rich functionality and getting all that information and having that prompt e-commerce channel. So if you guys have any general thoughts, maybe Robert, if you have anything that stuck out to you over the course of the conversation.
So, I mean, I think all of this is for the betterment of security. So I think that's a super important element, especially in larger merchants that, to be frank, actually bring in some money. I do think for the single sole proprietors that maybe take 1 or 2 transactions a month, I do think there's some added complexity that potentially could put PCI requirements could push them away, and that does worry me. At the end of the day, we want to encourage payment security, and we want to encourage, I would say from a QSA standpoint, obviously they want to support, Visa, MasterCard, your Amex, your credit cards, especially when there's so much competition right now in the how to get paid space. So it'll be interesting to see how the market handles it. But for the larger companies, I do think this is a huge opening. And I'm excited about, companies like Source Defense coming in and providing solutions that will ultimately secure customers' data.
Awesome. Jeff, a couple words, any thoughts?
Yeah, just to sort of piggyback on what Robert's saying, I having been in this business for a long time, the PCI business and the idea of scope, from years ago, companies, entities discovering, wait, if I don't have card data on this server, I don't have to do all the things to it. And I always used to argue, well, but there isn't much in PCI data security standard that you shouldn't be doing everywhere anyway, because you've got other things that you care about. You've got other critical and sensitive data. Case in point, a week or two ago, when was it? When Ticketmaster was, went public that they've been breached. And from what I haven't read anything recently, because I'm working on a rock, but that's another topic. But early reports were they got some database compromise and lots of information was in there, but it appeared that the credit card data was protected properly. It was encrypted at rest, but there was a whole lot of other data out there that people maybe didn't like having published. Reminds me of the Anthem breach many years ago, where a lot of customer data was breached and compromised, but it was kept separate from the healthcare data, so they were HIPAA compliant, but the focus was just off. And I think about how it's a continuous battle, at least for me and my clients, to help them keep focused on the things that matter from a security perspective, PCI related and beyond. But in this specific instance, brick and mortar is kind of going away. We're kind of in a new world now where more and more people are ordering things online. So more and more the bad guys are looking to where the volume is. Robert mentioned there's money to be made. Well, there's money to be made for the bad guys as well. And they think of this at some level from a business perspective as well. And they want to get the most bang for their buck from their efforts to try to steal and all that kind of stuff. So, the attention being on e-commerce, I think is coming at the right time in our history. And the more we can do to educate and help all of our merchant clients embrace, now you really need to do this stuff and stop being picky uni over the definitions of words to try to de-scope things. Embrace, they want everything to be secure that is associated with whatever you're calling your e-commerce online presence.
I want to give the rest of us an opportunity, although we are running out of time, but we're going to throw a couple links in the chat. If anyone would like to see what Source Defense can do, it's free, it's external, there's no deployment. We can get you a scan set up basically instantaneously. The link is in the chat. One more thing I wanted to offer is that we do have an essential guide to PCI DSS and kind of the overall history of this, not PCI DSS 643 and 1161, but the overall history and how it plays. So if you're looking for more of a general white paper kind of thing, we'll provide the link to that as well. So Richard, Kyle, and Sully, I've kind of given you the short end of the stick, quite literally here. We can go over a little bit, but what would you gentlemen, what do you think? What should people do about payment page security? Maybe Richard, if you want to go first with a couple words.
I would just say that if you're not sure what to do, you should reach out to a QSA. There's plenty of us out there that will provide, small package consulting just to get you the answers you need and point you in the right direction.
Mr. Hinterberg?
I would say that this is more evidence of the edge disappearing in a sense. You know, it used to be requirement 1 around network security controls was your edge. Now it's requirement 6, how you're developing your website, and requirement 8 for how you access that. That's really becoming the edge.
And certainly last but not least, Sully.
Thank you. I would say I talk to somebody, realize that you're not. You don't have to go through this alone. Just like you see a dentist on a recurring basis, you should be keeping tabs on your environment on a recurring basis so you don't fall behind or fall victim to something that you're missing.
And don't talk to the manufacturer of the drill. Talk to the dentist.
So call your QSA and or dentist, depending. Probably don't get those mixed up, though. That's not going to. I want to thank each and every one of you who attended and our participants here. It's really been invaluable for me. I hope the same for our audience. As I mentioned, if anybody wants to take a look at their own stuff, I do feel Source Defense is a very good option for anybody. So if you hit up our website, you can get a look at exactly what we do and how we do it on your own site today. Once again, gentlemen, Kyle, Richard, Sully, Jeff, and Robert, thank you so very much for your time. Thank you to the audience, and I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Matt.
Thank you.